All right, let's talk about the UN and a story that, again, just did not get enough coverage over the weekend. Remember how Anthony Albanese and everyone said, Scott Morrison has to go to that UN meeting about climate change. He must go to it, even though we were banned from being able to go for it because we believe in the natural resource of coal, because we believe that places like India should be able to come out of the third world into the modern age by being able to burn something other than cow dung to be able to make sure that they can heat their homes. But, you know, that first world stuff, that's only for us people here in Australia, right? And then, of course, once we sit in that modernity, we turn around and hate every minute of it, right? Well, the UN made a series of decisions after that panel, after that meeting we must have attended. And guess what? They didn't really even cloak it in any other conversation. It was that wealth should be taken from nations like Australia to the third world under the name of climate change. It, of course, has nothing to do with climate change, but again, reordering the world the way that the woke people want it.
The United Nations is calling for a brave new world financial order to tackle climate change. In its latest report, the UN says a global Green Deal is needed to make a clean break from what it says are years of austerity and insecurity after the global financial crisis. The measures include new controls on the movement of money, demanding more from developed nations, targeting sovereign wealth funds and setting a global minimum tax rate for multinationals. The push is at odds with Donald Trump's address to the General Assembly this week. The US president told world leaders to reject globalism and look out for the interests of their own countries first. The report comes amid calls for a new summit with leaders from China, the EU and the US to reshape multilateralism and replace the post-war Bretton Woods system that has set the current economic order. Danica Di Giorgio, Sky News.
Well, there we go, Adam. At least they're open about it. So this was the meeting that, of course, we must attend, must be there if we're not there. So this was the idea that Australia was going to turn up. Now, while Australia does not, strictly speaking, have a sovereign wealth fund, probably an example of it would be something like the Future Fund, which is put aside to make sure that we can pay for the superannuation of public servants. But this is something that a lot of countries have in case of a rainy day. It's what you would do if you wanted to dip in and get a few $1 billion to build pieces of infrastructure. But no. That should be carved up and sent to the third world, Adam.
Well, I think the UN's becoming more and more irrelevant every day as we hear about the reports that come out of it. I think it's like Christy was just saying, 86% of members of the MEAA are unionists, out of the industry are unionists. I mean, everyone who goes to the UN are people who are from the left, union-type people. I think the outcomes that they're projecting are not in line with countries like Australia, what the majority of Australians think. But let's have a look at what the decision that came out of the UN was. To take money off countries like Australia and those sovereign wealth funds, but where would that money go? Is it going to go to some of the smaller, impoverished nations in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and where would that money go towards? It's going to go towards governments, bureaucracies, people who are flying around in aeroplanes, driving big flash cars, all of which contribute to the carbon emissions issue that people like to talk about around the nation. From what I would like to see is better trade relationships with some of these countries where we can start investing in jobs and growth and helping people come out of poverty. I mean, all this conversation about Adani, which seems to have died down for a while, but what it will do to many of the impoverished in India, 1 million households, will now be able to get power instead of throwing lumps of coal on the fire inside the household or burning rubber tyres. I mean, these are the things that contribute so much to global emissions and global warming that people like to talk about. And if you want to discuss things at the UN, you've got to talk about tangible outcomes, real-world measures, such as what Prime Minister Morrison talked about when he talked about getting rid of plastic bags. I mean, that is something tangible that you can see that we can have direct influence over, not just taking money out of Australians' back pockets and giving it to another bureaucracy in another country that will be poorly administrated.
Christy, countries like Saudi Arabia and China, in fact, China has the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, these very same lefties would argue against things like what the Prime Minister had to say, that God forbid the country that is the second biggest economy in the world, that has a sovereign wealth fund bigger than any country in the world, well, that's still a developing country, so we wouldn't take any money from them. No, instead, it'll be the United States and places like that. And, of course, all of this was signed off by people, as Adam says, who live well and truly at the front end of the plane.
Just to your point of the debate currently occurring around Prime Minister Morrison's words on the reclassification of China, from a developing country. We should just look at the strategy behind this that Labor is playing. First of all, as you mentioned, they've accused the Prime Minister of being missing in action at the climate change meeting when, we weren't invited to go. They have now accused him of trying to upset China by standing with Trump. They're playing on the fact that they believe that most people in Australia don't like Donald Trump and they want to wedge Scott Morrison for cozying up to the United States, somehow also upsetting China, but they refuse to acknowledge the Prime Minister's words that, well, if China gets reclassified, they don't get access to $100 billion in finance and they have to pare back their emissions because they currently are allowed extra concessions to produce emissions until 2030 under the classification of being a developing nation. Nowhere have I heard Penny Wong, Richard Marles and other climate proponents in Labor congratulate Prime Minister Morrison for that fact. Instead, they are trying to wedge him on his relationship with Donald Trump, saying it upsets China. And I understand the tactic here, but I think Prime Minister Morrison has his own tactic on why he has chosen those words very carefully as he was. And Richard Marles today suggesting that the Prime Minister has done the wrong thing and talking about Australia's trade relationships being in jeopardy. This is the man who suggested that a collapse in coal markets would be a good thing.
Correct. Well, Richard Marles might not be the brightest when he says things like that. I mean, clearly he's made an error of judgment there, and I think he'd probably try and take it back. And I'm no defender of Richard Marles. But his point on China and the language that Scott Morrison chose to use in the US, I think is right. I think the trade relationship with China is in a perilous state. Our relationship with China is in a perilous state. I mean, there's a lot of conversation right now about the drought and its impact on farmers. You have a look at those documents that were signed, those agreements that were signed by Foreign Minister, or then Foreign Minister Andrew Robb, the free trade agreement with China. What that's done for the agricultural sector in Australia, so many farmers rely on that agreement. But when we keep throwing sand in the face of China, there will become a day when those relationships around trade will start to be wound back. And you think the farmers got it tough now with the drought. Wait till people stop buying our product, of which the majority, in terms of trade, goes to China. So I think Richard Marles has a very good point, and I think we need to correct that relationship with China. And we should be sending an invitation to Xi Jinping to try and get an invitation, to get a one-on-one to start rebuilding or resetting that agenda.
Sure, I've got no problem with that. And that's, sorry, Christy, look, I've got no problem with that. But in terms of reaching out to China, but also, I mean, Adam, this is the country that is building islands in the sea and then just pretends that it's its own country. This is a joint that is not open and fair and democratic like lots of other places. I get it. It's a place where Australia made a decision a long time ago to view it as the 1 billion consumers and sort of look the other way on human rights and all the rest of it. But I mean, Scott Morrison simply, it's not unfair to say that it's not a developing... I mean, at what point are you not a developing country? When you're the number 2 in the world, number 1 sovereign wealth fund, sure, do we have to wait until it's an even split between those in the first world? It's about, 600 million who are versus 700 million who aren't in that country? I mean, come on. You're allowed to push back without fear of them showing displeasure. I'm sorry.
I don't disagree that you're allowed to push back, and those points that you raise about being a developing nation or a developed nation, I think, are fair and reasonable.
That's what he said.
But on every element across the commentary of government, we're throwing sand in the face of China. And when they are the leading statistic of tourists, of international tourists that come to Australia and support our tourism industry. Look what would happen in Tasmania if the Chinese tourists stopped coming. And I'm not saying that's a reason that we don't push back. I'm saying we've got to be smarter with our language. Look where our agricultural money, look at our big export earner in terms of international education. We rely on them from a trade point of view. So many jobs, so many royalties in terms of taxes that support hospitals and schools and police services. And all of this, we need to be smarter in the way we do it. And if we want to complain about what's going on in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia more generally with relationships such as Fiji and Vanuatu and Indonesia and so forth, Australia took their eye off the ball in Southeast Asia in some of these smaller countries in the Pacific. And I put my blame fair and square at Foreign Affairs and Trade. If you want to start changing the narrative of those sort of issues, such as Southeast Asia. Start giving blokes like Matt Canavan, one of the best performing ministers in Cabinet, give him a role in foreign affairs and get him out into the region, to the north of Australia, and doing some trade relationships, and you'll start to change their narrative and the relationship, and the impact of China won't be as bad. But let's stop throwing sand in the face of the Chinese, because it will come back to bite.
Yeah, Christy, I've got to go take a hard break in about 30 seconds here because we're on win, and I want to make sure that we follow the rules, or the Greens will be sending complaints up the yin-yang. We'll have to deal with that next week. The other thing just about this climate change money from the UN, isn't it always interesting that democratisation never comes as a condition for this money? Because, let's be honest, many of the countries that are in the third world are hardly run by governments that resemble anything like ours.
Yeah, that's entirely right. My point that I was making, and I accept your views there, Adam, we have a lot of at stake, particularly agriculture and international education. Certainly, you know, I think the universities are 70% exposed to markets such as China and certainly India as well. But the point is that Labor is trying to wedge the Prime Minister around the issue of climate, and their message is entirely mixed by not congratulating him by making that point. Other issues, certainly, but on this particular one, it's a particular wedge tactic on climate and on energy that they are trying to play.